Every morning for 3 years he set out 2 coffee cups, one for himself, one for a woman who'd only ever existed in letters. But on the first day of fall, it wasn't her that came down the trail. It was 400 Apache warriors, silent and still on the ridgeline. No guns were drawn, no demands were made, just a wooden box placed in the dirt. And a name he thought he'd buried with his badge. Stay till the end. Some ghosts don't want revenge. They want the truth. Part 1. The Empty Chair. The wind came early in Dry Willow, not loud, not cruel, just a steady drag through the cottonwoods behind Clint Redford's cabin. It carried no news, no company, only dust from the south trail and the smell of morning ash. Inside, the floor creaked beneath his boots as he set the coffee pot over the low flame. He didn't whistle. He didn't speak. Most mornings didn't call for that. The tin pot hissed. He waited. The waiting had become routine, like brushing dust from the same 2 chairs, setting out 2 enamel cups on the warped pine table, one for him, one for someone else. That second cup had never been used, though he cleaned it all the same. There was no mold on it. No lips had touched it, but it waited like a prayer that wasn't quite said. By the window, folded once and yellowing along the crease, sat the letter. He didn't read it anymore. He had it memorized. Every curve of the handwriting, every cautious word. June Weatherby. She'd written him from over near Chulla Crossing, said she'd heard of him through someone named Avery Mott, said she'd arrive on the first day of fall if she wasn't dead by then. That was 3 seasons ago. The letter never said what she looked like, never mentioned love or even kindness, just, "I will come if I am able." That kind of honesty stayed with a man, even when hope didn't. Clint poured the coffee slow, let the smell fill the room. The cabin was clean in that half-finished way. Everything swept, nothing decorated. The walls were bare save for one nail where a badge used to hang, and a warped mirror above the hearth that didn't show much anymore. He took his cup and sat down. The second one stayed across from him, empty, quiet. 3 years ago, Clint had been sheriff of Burnt Ridge. He'd left in silence, not because he was angry or betrayed, though there'd been both, but because something in him had closed up like a book with too many burned pages. When the smoke cleared, he'd packed one saddlebag, left the badge in a coffee tin, and didn't say goodbye to a soul. Dry Willow was a place folks passed through but never settled. Just enough trees to call it shade, just enough fence to call it land. The kind of place where you could be left alone if you made it clear you needed to be. Clint had made it plenty clear he'd built the porch himself. One rail slightly crooked, never fixed. The roof leaked in the northeast corner, where rain tapped out stories he didn't want to hear. But the chair across from him stayed clean. It had a straight back and a pine knot in the armrest, smoothed from his thumb resting there each time he passed it. He'd never sat in it. He wouldn't dare. It belonged to a promise. Fall crept in slow that year. The leaves didn't so much turn as fade, like folks too tired to protest the coming cold. The mornings were crisp, the sky stretched pale and silent, and the creek behind the house dropped low enough you could cross without wetting your boots. Clint kept the trail clear, kept the gate unlatched, kept the horses fed and the kettle on the stove. He told himself it was habit, not hope. He slept light enough to wake at any noise, even the soft rustle of a rabbit under the floorboards, or the gust that rattled the shutters like knuckles on an old man's hand. He wasn't waiting, not exactly, but he wasn't forgetting either. Sometimes he thought of her. Name? June. Soft and simple, like rain after a long drought. He didn't know her voice, didn't know her face, didn't even know what she expected from a man like him. But the way she ended her letter set stayed with him. If I arrive and you've changed your mind, I'll understand. But I've already chosen to come. That is my part. That kind of choice did something to a man, made him sit straighter, made him clean the corners, made him open the curtains each morning just in case. That morning Clint had just stepped outside with his coffee when something strange caught his ear. A sound too rhythmic for wind, too deep for cattle hooves. He froze near the railing, gaze drifting north toward the ridgeline. The cottonwoods were still, no birds, just a faint echo in the distance. One beat, then another, like a heart not his own. He stepped down into the dust, boots sinking a little into the morning chill. He listened hard. It came again, a drum, not one, several, slow, deliberate, unhurried. He hadn't heard drums like that since the war. His hand went to his belt, not for a weapon, just reflex. The coffee in his cup trembled a ripple across the surface. His dog, a mutt too old to bark without reason, let out a low whine and slinked beneath the porch. Clint turned his head, scanning the tree line beyond his fence. Nothing yet, but the sound was growing clearer, steady as the breath of something large. He looked at the second chair. Still empty. He'd expected someone, but not this, and certainly not 400 of them. Part 2. The Drums on 3 Hills. Clint Redford had just finished scraping a new coat of oil onto the boots he'd had since Texas, was a whisper. The leather cracked when he flexed them in the shade. He'd polished them out of habit more than pride, like whittling a stick or rolling a smoke that'd sit untouched by the lamp all night. It was quiet, the kind of quiet dry willow gave you when it wasn't yet cold enough to shiver, but no longer warm enough to believe the summer might come, back. A wind passed, soft and pine-edged. The dog, half blind and older than the youngest memories Clint still trusted, raised its snout to the air and whined once. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to cattle or wind. A rhythm too slow for hooves and too solid for thunder. It started distant, like some old grudge being beaten out on a mountain's ribs. Then it came again, louder, fuller. Boom, wait, boom, wait. Clint stood, hand resting not on a pistol but the doorknob. That's how long it had been since he'd needed to reach for a weapon first. He turned his head just slightly, the way men do when they want to pretend the earth itself might be lying. But it wasn't. The sound rolled again. Steady, intent. He went inside and fetched the field glass from the mantel. Hadn't used it in months. Wiped the lens with his shirt. Then he stepped out onto the porch, past the chair no one had sat in for 3 years, and lifted the glass. He scanned the hills. First ridge to the west, nothing. Then slowly higher, toward the long spine of granite folks called the Horseshoe. And there they were. First he thought it was brush moving, but brush didn't line up shoulder to shoulder, didn't carry spears tipped with silver glint, and didn't stand that still. Through the glass, he counted men, 5, 10, 30, and beyond them, on the next rise, more. Silent, motionless, he swung the lens south, another ridge, another line, same posture, same steel, same silence, then east. They stood like ghosts given form. Each man was spaced out, not like a war party, not like raiders, no circling, no waving of arms, no sound but the drum, just stillness. 400 if he had to guess. Could have been more, could have been every Apache left in the territory for all he knew. They didn't advance, they didn't wave threats, they just stood, like they were waiting for something that didn't need shouting. Clint lowered the glass and stood a long while with both hands resting on the rail. The dog had retreated under the porch. The cows had bunched tight behind the barn, and even the chickens had gone quiet. Nature knew better than to argue with what was already written. This wasn't war, not yet, but it sure as hell wasn't peace either. The kind of stillness that settles before a man gets judged. He walked back inside and set the glass down. Didn't bother locking the door, wouldn't have mattered much, and the idea of hiding felt small. too late in his life to get small now? He stood before the mirror in the hallway. It was clouded and pocked with age, but it showed enough. His beard had grayed in odd patches, as if sorrow had painted it by hand. His shirt was threadbare at the collar, and his eyes, those betrayed him most. A man could lie with a badge, with a bullet, even with a prayer. But his eyes never did learn how. He looked at the boots again, still on the floor, still shined, still waiting. He sat in the chair by the window next to the letter. It hadn't moved in months. The ink had begun to bleed into the fibers. The sentence, "I'll arrive on the first day of fall," was still clear. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it, like he always did when the weight in his chest asked him what he was waiting for. He didn't know. Not anymore. And yet something about those drums, low and old as the land, made it feel like the waiting was over. The wind picked up again. He could hear the faint thunk of the porch swing moving ever so slightly, even though no one sat in it. That's when he knew. This wasn't about the woman in the letter. Not anymore. Maybe it never had been. This was about something long buried, finally clawing its way back above the dust. He didn't reach for a weapon. Not yet. Instead, he opened the old cedar chest by the fire. Inside were two things, a tin of coffee and a bullet belt he hadn't buckled in nearly 4 years. He took the coffee, because judgment never rushed in the West. It rode quiet, stood still, and waited for you to walk out and meet it. Part 3, The Rider Who Came with a Flag. The next morning, Clint stood on the porch, same way he had for years, except this time he didn't bring his coffee. The tin sat untouched on the stove, flame cold. His boots, oiled just yesterday, were laced tight. He hadn't put them on with this much intention since, well, maybe since the day he walked away from Burnt Ridge. The sun hung low but bright, casting long shadows over the plains and brush. The drums had stopped sometime during the night. The silence that followed wasn't a relief. It was a waiting kind. The sort that makes men shift in their boots and wonder if they missed something when they blinked. Then, just past the bend where the trail forked near the wind-warped cottonwood, Clint spotted him. A lone figure on horseback, moving slow but sure. The horse was lean, dark. The rider wore no feathers, no paint, just a long shirt of soft buckskin and a hat, with the brim turned up in front. In his hand, a pole, tied to the top of it, a white cloth, not bright white, weather-worn, dust-smudged. But, clear enough, he wasn't galloping, he wasn't charging, he was arriving. The dog under the porch gave a single bark, then curled back into its shadow. Clint didn't move, just watched. The rider stopped about 50 paces from the porch, didn't dismount, didn't wave, just sat his horse like a man who knew time would do the talking. Clint stepped down. The dirt underfoot was still damp from last week's rain. It held the print of every hoof that had come and gone in the last day. Tracks going in all directions, except one, none going away. When Clint got halfway to the gate, the rider finally spoke. "You the man who calls himself Redford?" His voice was calm. No threat in it, but no reverence either. A voice that had asked this question before, maybe many times. Clint didn't answer right away. He studied the man. High cheekbones, eyes dark and steady, hands that rested loose on the reins but close enough to move fast if needed. A scar ran from the corner of his jaw to his collarbone, faint but old, earned in something that wasn't a game. "I am," Clint said finally. "Who are you?" The rider reached into the pouch at his side and pulled out a folded document. He nudged the horse a few steps forward, then tossed the paper over the gate. It landed at Clint's feet, edges curling in the breeze. "She was on the wagon," the man said. "The woman." Clint crouched, picked up the paper. It was a death certificate. Name, June Weatherby. Cause, snakebite. Date, 2 weeks ago. Witness, running bear. He looked up. The writer nodded once. And I was there when she died. She asked me to carry the letter. She said you were expecting her. Clint felt his fingers go cold, even in the morning sun. She say anything else? The man dismounted then. Quietly, without drama, he stepped forward, careful not to cross the gate. She said you were a man worth waiting for. Once. Clint's jaw clenched. The writer added, but it wasn't her in the wagon now. It's someone else. Someone who knows you better than June ever did. That was a knife. Turned slow. Clint asked, almost against his will, who? She didn't give a name. Said you'd remember her when the time was right. Said she wasn't here to settle old debts, just to remind you that you still owe them. The writer took a breath. I'm running bear. I owe her my life. Clint furrowed his brow. Years ago, Bear continued, I was left for dead near the Pecos. Snakebite like June. No medicine, no water. She found me. Treated the wound. Gave me shelter. Never asked for anything. Clint swallowed. Bear's voice stayed even. I was half-starved, scared. Thought I'd die anyway. She gave me a name to say if I ever made it out. Yours. Clint blinked. Why me? You tell me. The morning stretched thin around them. Far off, the hills still bristled with waiting. Bear stepped back toward his horse, but didn't mount. She asked one last thing, he said, to make sure you didn't run. Clint looked him full in the face. You expect me to stand here with 400 warriors surrounding my land and... what? Pretend this is just some message run? Bear didn't flinch. They're not here to kill you. Then why come at all? They're here so you can't leave before she speaks. Clint exhaled, hard. It all felt like too much. The silence, the memory, the shame that never rotted properly, just dried and waited for the right wind. I didn't run, Clint said. Bear tilted his head. Didn't you? They stood like that for a while. Two men, both shaped by different losses, both old enough to know nothing. Good comes quick. Finally, Bear mounted again. He held the reins loose, one hand resting over the horn. She'll be here by dusk, he said. I suggest you listen. Then, as silent as he came, Bear turned the horse and rode off toward the far ridge, where the others still stood. Clint didn't watch him go. He looked down at the paper in his hand. Not June. And yet somehow this felt more personal than any letter she'd ever sent. Someone who knew him better than she did. Someone he'd forgotten or tried to. The wind shifted. A crow called from the roof of the barn, and inside Clint's ribs, a weight began to press harder than it had in years. Part 4. Old name, old wounds, old blood. Clint Redford hadn't heard his old title in years. Not spoken out loud, anyhow. But as the sun dropped low and the shadow of the hills crept toward his porch like a rising tide, the words came back, not in his own voice, not even in Bear's. They rode in on the wind, thick with dust and memory. Sheriff Redford, Burnt Ridge, the raid, the fire. He leaned against the porch post, thumb brushing the grain of the wood where his rifle used to hang. That spot had been empty a long time. He hadn't wanted to feel like a lawman anymore, hadn't wanted to remember how it ended. But today didn't care what he wanted. He heard the wheels before he saw the wagon. It wasn't fast, just steady, like a funeral procession with no hurry left. The dog under the porch didn't bark this time, just lifted its head and sniffed the air like it already knew who was coming. Clint stepped down. The wagon stopped just past the edge of his yard, between the well and the dying yucca bush. A woman sat upright in the back, wrapped in a gray shawl that had seen better years. Her boots touched the ground before the dust fully settled. She moved slow, but not like she was hurt. More like she was measuring each step, weighing the land. He didn't recognize her at first, not by face, not by name. She hadn't given one, but something in the way she paused after stepping down, the way she looked at the porch, at the worn path to the door, like she'd been here before, in a different life. Then she reached into the wagon bed, pulled out a wooden box. It was carved with simple symbols. Apache, he figured. Clint didn't know the meanings, but they looked like wind and mountain and a bird whose wings curved around the corners. She carried it to the dirt square between them and knelt, setting it down like something sacred. Then, with her hands resting on her thighs, she looked up at him. Still didn't speak. Not yet. Clint's voice came out dry. "You knew June." She shook her head. "I knew who she was. That's different." Her voice was soft, but it cut clean through the air. "I didn't come for her," she added. "I came because of you." Clint squinted. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember." "I wouldn't expect you to," she said. "Not after what you called me back then." She stood. The shawl slipped a little. Her eyes didn't. "Sheriff Redford," she said flatly. "Burnt Ridge Massacre." The words dropped like stones in the dirt. Clint didn't flinch, but inside something cold unfurled, like a rope uncoiling in a dark barn. "I was there," she continued. "I was 8. My father's name was Jonah Stonetree. You kicked open the door while he was still trying to explain. He covered me with his body. Your bullet went through his back." Clint's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She stepped forward once. Not angry, just steady. People say the past is the past, but it isn't. It waits. The wind shifted. The hills behind her still held their silent army. The warriors didn't move. Didn't need to. "You gave the order," she said. "You raided the outpost thinking it was smugglers, runners. Maybe it was, but you didn't check. Didn't wait." He started, but the words stumbled. She raised a hand, palm out. Not to accuse, to pause. "You weren't the only one who lost something," she said, "but you were the only one who got to walk away." Clint exhaled, long and hollow. "I didn't know there were children," he muttered. "That's the problem," she replied. "You didn't know. And then you didn't stay." Silence stretched between them. It wasn't hostile, just heavy. Clint stared down at the wooden box. "That was your father's." She nodded. "He carved it, stored seeds and tobacco inside. Now it holds every paper I've kept. Letters, confessions, witness names." She stepped back, letting the box sit between them like a third person. "I'm not here to kill you, Clint Redford. I could have done that 10 years ago, or yesterday. We've known where you were." "Then why come now?" She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Because June believed you were still a decent man under all that silence. And because Bear owed me. I told him not to bring blood, just truth." Clint nodded once. Slow. "And the warriors? They're here so you don't run." That hit harder than anything else. He looked to the hills again, to the silhouettes that hadn't flinched since morning. Not one of them had crossed the fence, but they didn't have to. Their presence was a wall he couldn't walk through. "They're not angry?" he asked. "They're not here for anger. They're here for justice." She looked toward the house, the chair on the porch. "You've been hiding, Sheriff. You thought waiting would be penance enough, but that's not how redemption works." He ran a hand down his face, beard rough against his palm. "What do you want me to do?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back, turned, and walked toward the wagon. Before climbing up, she looked over her shoulder. "At dusk," she said, "I'll open the box. If you still have any honor left, you'll sit and listen." Then she disappeared into the wagon, the fabric flap falling shut behind her. Clint stood in the yard, boots dusted, chest tight. He didn't move for a long while, didn't need to. The ghosts were already circling, whispering names he hadn't said in years. Names like Stone Tree, names like Sheriff. And as the sun bled into the ridges, Clint knew tomorrow wouldn't be about mercy. It would be about whether he had anything left in him that was worth forgiving. Part 5. The Wagon and the Gray Dress. The next morning came slowly, without birdsong. Clint Redford sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He hadn't slept, not really. Not after the weight of her words the night before. Rachel Stone Tree. He said the name under his breath now, like testing the sharpness of a blade dulled by time. It still cut. The wind smelled of sage and the faint sour tang of ironwood dust. He stared out over the yard, past the wheel ruts where the wagon had stopped, and toward the high hills beyond. 400 Apache warriors still hadn't moved, still guarding nothing but silence, and the woman in the wagon. He stood up slowly, joints stiff with age and regret, and stepped off the porch toward the center of the yard. The wooden box was still there, exactly where she'd left it, its corners catching the early light like old scars. At dusk, she had said, but dusk came early when you were waiting. He chopped wood, fed the dog, swept out the barn, though it didn't need it. Every now and then he'd glance at the wagon, hoping maybe she'd come out early. Say something, shout even, give him something to anchor to. But the canvas flap didn't move. Until just after sundown, no trumpet, no words, just the quiet thud of boots hitting dirt. She stepped down in that same slow, measured way, but now she wasn't wrapped in a shawl. She wore a gray dress, not fancy, not new. It hung on her like it had been worn in another life and folded for years since. Her sleeves were rolled at the forearm, her boots scuffed, and her hair, once pulled back in tight braids, was loose now. Falling past her shoulders in waves, the wind tried and failed to lift. Rachel Stone Tree carried herself like someone who had walked through fire once and remembered exactly how it burned. Clint didn't speak. Neither did she. She walked past the box straight toward the porch and stopped just short of the steps. Not too close, never close. Just enough for her shadow to touch his boots. She looked at the chair, the empty one, the one June never sat in. "May I?" she asked, nodding to it. Clint stepped back and motioned with a tired hand. "It's been waiting." She sat down slow, not from pain, just the weight of the moment. Her eyes scanned the yard once, then settled on the box. She didn't point to it, didn't ask him to open it. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something folded, a letter. Yellowed at the edges, the writing faded but still legible. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, holding it out. He took it in both hands. Something about the paper felt familiar before his eyes even landed on the handwriting. "I wrote this," he said, voice tight. "You did," she replied. "To a mother named Martha Solis after the raid. You told her that her son was killed resisting arrest. You told her it was clean. You didn't know that boy was in the cellar trying to hide his little sister." Clint stared down at the ink. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask." That hit harder than any bullet. She folded her hands in her lap. "There are more in the box. Letters, maps, names, all tied to that day. The Corgan brothers tipped off the law and let innocent people die to cover their smuggling tracks. You were the hammer. They just aimed you." He set the letter on the porch rail like it might burn him. Rachel's gaze didn't soften, but it steadied. "I'm not here to haunt you," she said. "I'm here to finish something." Clint leaned on the porch post, shoulders sagging. "You didn't have to bring all those warriors just to speak." "They're not for speaking," she said. "They're for listening." A breeze passed through the cottonwoods. One leaf drifted down and landed near the box like punctuation. "Why now?" Clint asked. "Why wait all these years?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched the wind move the dry grass around the old well, as if trying to remember something important. "Because June Weatherby wrote to me before she died," she said finally. "Said a man can go to hell in silence, or he can walk through fire one last time and come out cleaner on the other side." He blinked. "She knew?" "She knew more than you thought. She was going to come here, Clint. Not to be your bride, but to stand in Rachel Stonetree's place. She didn't get the chance, so now I'm here, not to bury you, but to see if the man she believed in still exists." Clint sat down on the steps. The wood groaned under his weight. "I'm no lawman anymore." "No," Rachel said, "but you were once, and that means something, if you let it." They sat there for a while. Him on the step, her in the chair. The air didn't move much, but something between them did. Not forgiveness, not yet, but breath. And that was more than there'd been yesterday. Then she stood, walked back to the box, and opened it. Inside were documents tied with string, a revolver wrapped in cloth, and a pouch of dried tobacco. She handed him the revolver. "You may need this," she said. He turned it over in his hand. "For what?" "To stop what the Corgans are planning next." Her eyes met his. "You ready to hear it?" Part 6. Paper stained with dried blood. She didn't sit this time. Rachel knelt on the dirt next to the carved wooden box, like she was back in a church she didn't believe in but still respected. She reached in with quiet hands, unwrapped the cloth inside, and pulled out a bundle of old letters tied with twine. The edges were stiff and curled like they'd been through weather, or maybe grief. Clint stood across from her, not reaching, just watching. "These were smuggled out by a boy named Elias," Rachel said. "He was 14 when you raided the cabin. Hid in a feed barrel, waited until the fire died down. His mother didn't make it. She untied the bundle and spread the papers out across the lid of the box like a dealer laying down cards that had already been played and lost. There's your name. Right there." She tapped one. "Signed by the sheriff. Burnt Ridge. Approved search and seizure." Clint stepped forward, jaw tight. The seal was his ink, his mistake. Another paper, a hand-drawn map, showed trails leading out of Burnt Ridge into Dry Willow marked with symbols, crates, crossings, caves, smuggling routes. "You chased the wrong men, Clint," Rachel said. "But it wasn't just your error. They made sure of it." She held up a confession letter. The handwriting shook, as though the man who wrote it did so under the weight of a gun. Or conscience. "Jed Corgan signed this before he died. Said they tipped off the law to hit the old mission house, not the true crossing. Said you were too proud to double-check." Clint swallowed hard. "I remember Jed," he muttered. "He was always grinning like he knew something the rest of us didn't." "He did," Rachel replied. "He knew you'd carry that badge like a shield, that you'd believe what they told you because it came in neat words in ink." She pointed to another page. Stained reddish-brown. "That's blood. Not symbolic. Real. From the woman who passed it to me. She'd been holding it in her shirt for hours before I found her." The weight of that statement settled like dust over both of them. Rachel stood now. Her boots left faint marks in the earth beside the scattered letters, and for a long beat she didn't speak. When she did, her voice was low, not angry, just hollow, like the space between two fence posts left too far apart. "I didn't come here to make you pay." Clint's eyes flicked up. "I came to let you know. Guilt doesn't rot in a man's heart. It waits. Quiet, long, until it finds a reason to speak." He turned away, hands on his hips, back hunched like the words hit a little harder than he expected. June Weatherby, Rachel said again. She knew what you did, what you didn't. She believed you had one more ride left, one more right to make. He didn't answer. Rachel walked to the porch and laid one more letter in his hands. It was sealed in wax. He opened it slowly. Inside was a note, scribbled in a different kind of ink, softer script, older style, a woman's hand. It was from June. Clint, if she comes, listen. If she stays, stand. If she asks, ride. Love doesn't wait forever, but sometimes justice does. June. He folded the letter slowly like it might tear if he moved too fast. Rachel watched the way his fingers lingered over the crease. I don't want you to come with me, she said. Not because I need saving, not because I trust you. He looked at her. Then why? Because if there's still anything decent in you, you'll want to come for the children. That word stopped the wind. Children? She nodded. There's a train coming through Milford, day after tomorrow. It's carrying 43 orphans, headed west, unprotected. And the Corgan brothers, they know it. They've bribed the water station guard. They plan to hit the train at the switch just outside the ridge. Quick, quiet, no witnesses. Clint's voice dropped. They'd rob a train full of kids? Not for money, Rachel said. For leverage. There's someone on board they want, and the rest? Collateral. The old lawman in Clint stirred, angry and unsure. The kind of fury that builds behind silence, not shouts. He stared at the badge still rusting in his old tin by the hearth, the one he hadn't touched in years, the one that bent under pressure and never got straight again. Rachel stepped back off the porch. I'll be leaving at dawn, she said, with or without you. Then she turned and walked back toward the wagon. At the edge of the yard she stopped, didn't face him, just called over her shoulder, if you do come, don't bring your guilt, bring your aim. Part 7. The trainload of orphans. The night didn't move much after Rachel's words. The moon hung low like it was watching, not lighting, no wind. Just the slow creak of pine rafters, the pop of one coal shifting in the fireplace, and the breath of a man sitting in the dark, jaw locked, staring at a dented tin coffee can beside his boot. Inside that can was a badge. Bent, dull, heavy in memory, heavier in meaning. Clint didn't reach for it, not yet. He just sat, one hand curled around a cup gone cold, the other resting on his knee like it was waiting to be told what to do. There were no sounds from the yard. The Apache were still out there, camped silent beneath the cottonwoods. 400 men, not moving, not threatening, just waiting, like statues placed by God to remind a man his past never goes quiet. By morning he hadn't slept. But the decision wasn't in his face. It was in the way he moved. Slow, sure, like he'd already lived through what was coming and was just walking toward it because not walking wasn't an option. He walked to the hearth, squatted, pried open the tin. The badge hadn't changed, but maybe he had. He dipped it into a basin of rainwater left from the last storm, rubbed it with the edge of an old shirt. It didn't shine, not fully. Rust clung to its edges like time didn't want to let go. He pinned it on anyway. No speech, no sigh, just stood, tall and tired. When he stepped onto the porch, Rachel was already saddled. Running Bear waited by the post, his hand resting on his rifle like a man who wasn't here for war, but would finish one if it came. Bear saw the badge, gave a single nod, no smile, no salute, then blew a low whistle through his teeth. The sound carried. From behind the barn, horses emerged. 4 riders followed, 2 old, 2 young, all armed, their ponchos pulled tight against the morning air, their eyes never blinking. They didn't cheer. They simply rode behind Rachel. Clint mounted up without a word. They rode out slow, down the dry wash, across the gulch where the cottonwoods grew twisted and low, past the skeleton of the old rail station that burned 5 winters ago. Clint didn't look back at the house. There was nothing behind him worth seeing now. It wasn't until midday they picked up a 5th rider, a thin man on a piebald horse, red kerchief at his throat, hat pulled low, rifle slung across his back. Jessup. Clint didn't speak first, didn't need to. Jessup gave a hard glance. "You gonna leave me behind again, Sheriff?" Clint rode another 20 yards before answering. "You'd if you're riding right this time." Jessup gave a dry chuckle, the kind a man lets out when he's forgiven but still bruised. "I ain't the one wore a badge made of paper," he said. Then he clicked his tongue and fell in beside Clint. By nightfall, the group stopped near Ridge Hollow. Rachel made camp beneath a crooked juniper. Bear took first watch. Jessup sharpened a blade without urgency, and Clint sat on a rock, staring at nothing until a voice broke the quiet. "Clint!" He turned. A boy stepped into the firelight. 17, maybe. Dust-coated shirt, pants too short, boots patched with rawhide. He wasn't part of their group, not until now. Clint narrowed his eyes. "Toby?" The boy nodded, but there was no boy in his stare, only bone-hard silence. "You left my father bleeding in the street," Toby said. "He begged for help. You rode past." Clint didn't deny it. Toby took another step. "My mother buried him behind the smokehouse. You remember her name?" "I remember," Clint said. "I remember every face I didn't help." Toby dropped a canvas satchel to the dirt. A small pistol hung from his belt, but his hands didn't reach for it. They hung at his sides, curled tight. "I'm not here to forgive you," he said. "I'm here for the train." Clint looked at him a long time, then reached up, unpinned the badge, held it out. Toby stared. "I don't want it," he said. "It's not for you," Clint replied. "It's for someone down the line. If you ever see someone who deserves it, give it to him." Toby hesitated, then took the badge, didn't pin it, didn't speak. Just stepped back into the shadow of the group and sat with his own fire. By dawn, they reached the hill above Milford. Clint stood beside Bear, squinting through glass at the rail line. The tracks curved hard around the edge of the canyon, a good spot for a switch, a better spot for an ambush. Rachel knelt in the dirt, drawing marks with a piece of charred wood. "2 men here, 1 here." She pointed, "and I'll be on the flat car." Jessup grunted. "You ever fired in a dust storm?" "I've lived through worse." Toby sat quiet, whittling a twig, watching the rails like they owed him something. Clint didn't order, didn't command. He listened, let the others speak, not because he was weak, but because maybe this time they knew better. The train would come at 4 a.m. They had 8 hours. Bear's men melted into the brush. Rachel tightened the leather on her belt. Wore pants now, not the gray dress. A revolver rode her right hip like it had always belonged there. At one point, Jessup leaned toward Clint. "You trust her?" Clint didn't answer right away. Then, "She doesn't need me to." At midnight, the rain came. Not heavy, just enough to smear footprints and soften earth. "It would make the shots harder, the decisions clearer." Clint sat beneath a cottonwood watching the storm drift. Toby came and sat beside him. Neither spoke. Then, after a while, Toby reached into his coat, pulled out the badge, held it up. "I still don't forgive you," he said. "I know. But I think maybe you don't forgive yourself either." Clint didn't move, didn't speak, but something in his eyes broke loose, just a flicker, and the badge. Toby put it back in his coat, not to wear, but to carry. Part 8. The badge and the coffee tin. That night the wind died down, but the air felt heavier. Clint didn't light the lamp. He sat at the table, the one with the empty chair still pulled back just a hair, like someone had nearly taken a seat, but changed their mind. The kettle on the stove let out a soft hiss, but he didn't get up to stop it. Outside, the Apache campfires glowed like fallen stars across the ridgeline. 400 lights for 400 men who weren't asleep, just waiting. Rachel had gone quiet. After her final words, she'd stepped back into the wagon without another look. No door slammed, no horse snorted, just that stillness that always comes when truth hangs heavier than judgment. Clint stared down at his hands. The fingers were nicked and rough from fence work, but the knuckles, they still bore the old calluses from a gun that used to rest easy in his grip. It hadn't felt easy in years. He stood up slow, joints stiff from memory more than age, and crossed to the hearth. The floorboard beneath his third step creaked. He knew it would. He'd meant it too. You don't forget the sounds of a place when it's the only place left that hasn't turned its back on you. From under the brick lip of the hearth, he reached for the old tin. It had once held coffee years ago. Now it held something rusted and bent, a badge dulled with time, corner turned up where it had been stepped on, thrown away, almost forgotten. He pried the lid off. Inside, the metal sat atop a scrap of cloth. For a second, it looked like it might fall apart in his palm. Clint didn't speak, not even to himself. He walked to the basin, filled it with rainwater from the barrel out back, and dipped the badge in. The water turned dark with rust. He didn't mind. It didn't need to shine. It just needed to face the sun again. By dawn, the porch boards moaned under his boots. He'd shaved, tucked in a shirt he hadn't worn since Dry Willow's last harvest festival. It still smelled faintly of cedar and ash. The badge sat pinned just off-center over his heart, because that's how it had always sat. Not out of pride, but because the scar below it still ached when pressed. Rachel stood by the barn, hair tied back, jaw set. Her hands rested on the wagon like she wasn't sure if she'd leave it or burn it. Clint didn't say a word, just gave a nod, barely more than a breath of movement, but she saw it, and so did Bear. Up on the ridge, Running Bear raised his hand and gave a short, low whistle. One of the fires flickered out, then another, and another. The line began to shift, not toward the house, but outward, down the ridges. Quiet men mounting quiet horses, watchers becoming shadows once more. No applause, no cheers, just that soft rhythm of readiness, of a people who had stayed not for revenge, but for reckoning. Now they would let the man carry it on his own. Jessup arrived by mid-morning, his saddle dusty, his mouth tight with words he didn't plan to speak. Clint only handed him a map and pointed. Jessup followed without argument. No speech, no farewell, just one badge. Rusted clean, worn over a heart that finally beat steady, and the old lawman rode again. Part 9. Broken Trust on an Old Trail. The sun stayed low that morning, like it didn't want to rise too quick on what was about to happen. Clint, Rachel, Bear, and Jessup rode in a staggered line east of Dry Willow, past broken fence posts and mesquite roots that had curled up through the trail like old regrets. The path they took wasn't marked on maps. It cut between dry washes and whispering cottonwoods, following the land's memory more than direction. Clint hadn't ridden it since before the badge came off. Jessup rode a little behind him, not out of deference but caution. He still hadn't spoken more than a few clipped phrases. The last time they'd ridden together, Clint had turned the horse west when Jessup needed him to ride east. That night ended in blood and a body Clint hadn't stuck around to bury. Rachel kept to herself. She didn't ride behind or ahead, just parallel, always to Clint's left, like she didn't trust him at her back but wasn't ready to lead either. Her gray coat billowed in the dust, her father's box still secured in the rear of the wagon, wrapped in wool and something heavier. They made camp at a dry arroyo west of Oak Ridge. Just before sundown, a boy stepped out from behind the remains of a windmill. Toby. He wasn't more than 17, but his face had aged where it shouldn't have. Eyes like scorched earth. He wore a belt too big for his waist and boots he hadn't grown into. His rifle, though, rested in his arms like it belonged there. Jessup stiffened when he saw him. "Thought you left," he muttered. Toby just looked at Clint. "I was 10, the boy said. "My pa was shot through the chest by the Corgans. I ran to your office. You were still sheriff then, remember?" Clint didn't answer, not because he didn't remember, but because he did. "You told me to go home. Said it wasn't the law's place to meddle in feuds." Still, Clint said nothing. That night had played in his head more times than he'd admit. The way Toby's shirt had been soaked in blood. The way the boy had looked not scared but betrayed. Rachel didn't speak either. She just placed a hand on the camp kettle and stirred it with a wooden spoon. The silence was thicker than the stew. After dinner, Clint pulled something from his saddlebag and walked over to the boy. It was the badge. Same one he'd worn that morning, damp still from where he'd cleaned it. He didn't offer it like a gift. He just held it out. "If you ever see someone who deserves it," Clint said, voice low, "give it to him." Toby stared at the medal, didn't reach for it right away. Then, slowly, he took it. He didn't smile, didn't cry. But his grip tightened, and he placed the badge in his shirt pocket, like it was something that had weight again. They didn't talk more after that. The fire crackled. Bear slept with his knife still in hand. Rachel leaned against a wagon wheel, eyes closed but not asleep. Jessup stood guard. Clint sat with his back to the fire, hat low, staring at nothing in particular. He'd been running from one boy for years. Now that boy rode behind him, rifle in hand, badge in pocket. Trust doesn't return like a tide. It creeps, it waits, and sometimes it walks beside you with a scar on its face, and your failures tucked under its ribs. Part 10. Milford, Gun Smoke and Chalk Lines. They reached Milford at a little past 3:30 in the morning. The town was still, not asleep. Milford hadn't really slept in years, but hushed, like the buildings themselves were holding their breath. Clint reined in behind a grain warehouse on the south side of the tracks. Rachel and Bear dismounted without a word. Toby circled wide with Jessup, eyes scanning every rooftop like a dog sniffing for something it once feared. The water station sat just west of the depot, its tin roof barely catching the moonlight. No guards, no posted signs, just a stillness too quiet to be innocent. Bear's men, 5 of them, already crouched behind crates and rail ties. They didn't wear war paint, didn't raise feathers or shout. They just nodded at Bear, then vanished into the dark like they'd never been there at all. Rachel pulled her revolver from the wagon bed, checked its chamber with the casual confidence of someone who'd held a weapon since before she was old enough to be listened to. She wasn't wearing the gray dress anymore, just boots, riding pants, and her father's old hunting coat, patched twice at the elbow. "You sure?" Clint asked, his voice little more than gravel. Rachel didn't answer, just looked toward the horizon where the rail stretched empty into blackness. She touched the box in the wagon once, then stepped away. That was answer enough. By 4 o'clock the whistle came, distant and low. The train rolled in slower than it should have, like it knew it was arriving at something that didn't want guests. Bear gave a short hand signal. His men tensed. Clint crouched near the station wall, one eye on the depot door, one on the warehouse. Jessup flattened beside a coal bin. Toby took position high on the roof, where the shingles gave him sightlines and the moon gave him just enough light to judge a shot. The train hissed to a halt. Everything that happened next didn't take more than 5 minutes. 3 men leapt from the third car. Corgan's boys, sure as sin. One wore a priest's collar, one had a scar on his cheek like a bird had clawed it. The last had a red bandana tucked into his boot, the same color Clint remembered from the massacre, tied to a gun barrel outside the smuggler's post. The first shot didn't come from Clint, it came from Rachel. It struck the man with the collar clean in the chest. He dropped like a sack of oats. The others scattered, but the trap was already tight. Jessup's bullet hit the one with the red bandana in the leg, spinning him sideways. Toby's rifle cracked next. It didn't miss. Smoke rose. Not fire, just the white plume of gun smoke, thick, curling, choking out the dawn light. Inside the train car, cries sounded. Children, the orphans Rachel had spoken of, pressed their hands against the barred windows, faces pale, eyes wide. Clint moved fast. He kicked in the side door with a shoulder that hadn't been young in 10 years, and fired once, hitting a man who'd taken a nun hostage by the throat. Bear's knife found another. In the clamor, a cart axle cracked and buckled beneath the forward wheels. A little girl was pinned by a splintered board. Clint saw it just before falling debris caught his side. Rachel reached her first, dropping to her knees, lifting the beam just enough. Toby appeared out of nowhere and dragged the girl free, cradling her like a broken promise. And then, silence. It wasn't a hero's ending. No one cheered. No one lifted their arms. In victory. The children didn't shout freedom. They just stared, quiet, wide-eyed, at the people who'd killed to keep them breathing. Clint sat down hard in the gravel beside the tracks, his shirt dark from blood, some his, some not. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking, but they weren't steady either. Rachel walked past him, revolver lowered, boots coated in dust and ash. She didn't look back. That's how battles ended in the West. Not with flags, not with speeches, just with the kind of quiet that lets you feel your breath again. The morning light finally broke over Milford. No glory, no headline, just the tracks stretching onward, and the sound of wind scraping over blood that hadn't dried yet. Part 11. No names carved in stone. By evening, the sky over Milford was washed in that kind of pale gold that makes everything feel farther away than it is. The shootout was hours behind them, but the town still hadn't found its breath. No wagons came in, no whistles blew, not even the wind wanted to stir too much. Clint leaned against the frame of a tool shed behind the station, face bruised, one arm pressed tight against his ribs. There was blood crusted at his temple and a line of sweat that cut down through the dust, like a stream through canyon rock. Rachel sat a few feet away on the edge of the old loading dock, her father's box in her lap. She didn't open it this time, just ran her fingers along the carvings on its lid, familiar patterns, hand-chiseled curves that meant something long before they became relics. No one had spoken for a while. That kind of silence isn't awkward out there. It's survival. It lets the grief settle where it needs to, gives memory room to breathe. Jessup was tending to the orphans, or what was left of them. One boy had a cracked arm. A girl had a gash across her cheek that would scar if it didn't get cleaned proper. But they were alive. Toby had stayed near the train, cleaning his rifle not because it needed cleaning, but because his hands didn't know what else to do. He kept glancing at Clint like he wanted to say something, but didn't. That was the thing about Clint Redford. People didn't speak to him unless they had to. Even now, even after what he'd done, Bear's men had vanished as quiet as they came, into the mesquite and shadows, no fanfare. Just one nod from Bear before he mounted and rode east, the kind of departure that left no tracks but stayed in your bones. Clint sat upright and watched as Rachel stood, stepped lightly toward the wagon where the orphans were being helped into new clothes by the local nuns who'd arrived late, their rosaries clinking like wind chimes. She placed the carved box at the back of the cart, not in reverence, but in resolve. "I won't carry it any more," she said. Clint heard her but didn't answer. She turned to him, eyes dry but not hard. It belonged to a man who died trying to protect what mattered. It should ride with others who'll need the same. He gave her a long look, then just the smallest nod. No speeches, no forgiveness traded like coins in a Sunday sermon. Just a woman putting down the weight of inheritance, and a man knowing he was no longer the only one who'd lost something he couldn't name. The orphans didn't ask who she was. One small boy reached out and touched the lid of the box like it might hum under his fingers. It didn't, but it didn't have to. Jessup helped lift it in and tied it secure. Rachel looked once more at the sun, now almost gone behind the ridge. The shadows had changed shape. The old gilt that used to stretch behind Clint like a noose. It was still there, but it no longer looked like it would tighten. She walked back to where he stood. "They'll move on," she said, glancing toward the orphans, "and I think maybe so will I." Clint didn't ask where. Maybe he knew better than to ask. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. There were no names carved in stone that day, no plaques, no funerals. The Corgan brothers would be buried quietly, likely without even their last names remembered in town ledgers. But something else had been laid to rest, and that was enough. Part 12. The chair's not empty anymore. Morning came slow, the kind of morning where mist clings to the low brush and the dew's too stubborn to burn off quickly. At the edge of Dry Willow, where the land gave way to folding hills and far-off memories, Clint Redford stood on the porch of his house. He moved like a man whose ribs still ached, whose body remembered every fall it had ever taken. But he moved. Coffee boiled slow on the old iron stove. He didn't rush it, never did. Ritual had its own kind of steadiness, even if everything else had shifted underneath. Inside the cabin the table sat just as it always had, square, worn smooth in the middle, with 2 tin cups and 1 empty chair across from him. Only this time, the chair wasn't empty. Rachel Stonetree sat with her back to the window, sleeves rolled up, one hand wrapped around the tin mug. She hadn't said anything when she walked in that morning, just nodded once, the way people do when there's no need for more. The coffee was strong, bitter in the way frontier folk preferred, a bitterness that didn't ask for sugar, just silence. Clint didn't say much either. He poured 2 cups, same as always. One he slid toward her, one he kept, and that was it. No promises passed between them, no declarations, just a quiet understanding that sometimes a man waits for something, and when it doesn't arrive the way he imagined, he has to decide whether he's going to keep waiting or make room for something else. Rachel didn't ask what he'd do now. He didn't ask where she planned to go. She looked out past the porch rail, to where the fence curved into the tall grass and the wind bent the weeds like someone whispering secrets through their stems. Far off, a train whistle sounded, long and low, not like the shrill kind that brought trouble. This one was softer, like a sound that carried memory, not warning. Neither of them flinched. Clint took a sip. The tin was still warm in his hand, and for the first time in years he didn't glance at the door between every swallow. He just drank. Rachel set her mug down. Her hand lingered on the rim, thumb resting on the dented edge. "You think you'll ride again?" she asked, not quite looking at him. Clint breathed out slow. "I already did." She nodded once, then leaned back in the chair like it might hold her for a while. Outside, the breeze carried dust and birdsong, nothing urgent. The porch boards creaked under the weight of the morning, not heavy, just lived in, and for the first time in a long while, Clint didn't brace for what came next. He just let it come. Some debts aren't paid in coin or blood. Some are paid by staying, by listening, by facing the fire you once walked away from. Clint never spoke much after that ride. But the chair across from him was never empty again, and the wind that used to press against his walls, it softened. If this story settled somewhere quiet in you, maybe near a regret, maybe near a memory, feel free to share it in the comments. Not for applause, just to know you're not the only one who stayed long enough to remember what healing feels like out here.